Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Social Systems Design, Implementation, and Impacts in Overwatch talk today. Before I get started, the GDC organizers would like me to ask you to please silence all of your noise-making devices. They are recording this talk for the Vault, and I'm sure you have a great ringtone, but they don't really want it on the recording. Also, they will be sending out a survey link after the talk. Please take the time to fill it out so they can continue to bring you relevant and enjoyable talks in the future. Thank you. So my name is Natasha Miller, and I'm a research scientist on the Player Behavior Insights team at Blizzard. The goal of my team is to work with game teams and other organizations at Blizzard to champion our core value of play nice, play fair by minimizing the prevalence and impact of disruptive player behaviors through accurate detection, more effective penalization, and incentivizing pro-social behavior through data-informed feature design. My talk today will focus on the work I did in collaboration with the Overwatch team on incentivizing positive play. And spoilers, I will go over how these designs of the endorsements and LFG systems contributed to lower disruptive behaviors in Overwatch. So disruptive behaviors is a term that I'm going to use a lot in this presentation. So I'll just define it quickly to make sure everyone's on the same page. Disruptive behaviors are any negative behavior that disrupts the core intended experience of the game, whether intentional or not. This includes things like saying or typing horrible things into chat or voice, or intentionally losing, maybe by suiciding or just being AFK. There are many more examples of this, but I think this really starts to set the stage for this presentation. So, in this presentation, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the formation of the Overwatch Strike Team, what organizations are a part of that, and how we all work together. Then I'm going to go into a little bit about why Blizzard decided to prioritize social systems in Overwatch. And then next, I'm going to talk about how Blizzard approached these systems. And finally, we're going to get to my favorite part, which is the actual impacts that these systems had. And we'll find out how well any of this really worked. So we formed a strike team with members of many different teams across Blizzard, including Global Insights. This is actually the team I work for. We are the analytic arm of Blizzard, and we provide teams with both quantitative and qualitative data, as well as objective research and competitive intelligence. My specific team, the Player Behavior Insights team, consists of many different disciplines. We have research scientists, data scientists, engineers, and analysts. Obviously, the Overwatch team was a very critical part of the strike team, and they provided design, art, sound, leadership, engineering, and more to our efforts. Additionally, we worked with a team called Service Technologies that provided engineering support to connect all of our systems, including our customer service systems. So we not only worked with them on that, but we also were able to get a player perspective as well as getting help setting policy. And finally, we worked with the Blizzard Hacks team. So hacking and cheating are very specific types of disruptive behaviors that this team has become incredibly good at dealing with, but it was important for us to get a holistic view of what disruptive behaviors were happening in our game. And today, I'm going to go over our efforts around incentivizing positive play. And most of this work was done with the Overwatch team. And so I do want to go ahead and take a minute to recognize and thank everyone on the Overwatch team that designed and implemented these systems. Without all of the work they did, I would not be able to give this talk today. So super appreciate those guys. So now I'm going to just get into a little bit about why Blizzard decided to prioritize social systems in Overwatch. But first, I'm sure some of you know Overwatch, but for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, it's a 6v6 team-based hero game where your goal is to either escort or prevent the other team from escorting a payload or to control a point for a specific time. So for example, if you were on this map, it would be your job to either escort this plane or payload down the track or to prevent the other team from doing so by keeping most of your team members on it through the amount of time allocated. Or if you were on this map, your goal would be to keep most of your team members within the orange square for most of the allotted time. And there are some hybrid versions, but this is the basis of the game. So, being on the analytics team, something that was very natural for me was to go and look at the data, what our players were doing, how KPIs were changing, So after the strike team had been doing a lot of our initial efforts, I had to look at the data, and what I found was that less than 1% of our player base were consistently disruptive. This means that they had more than 2 penalties. This is actually quite a very small number of the total accounts in Overwatch. So what does this mean? And the first conclusion was that our penalization system seemed to be working. Not many players are repeat offenders. They are actually reforming, and this makes sense, as it's where we had put most of our initial efforts. We worked on accurate detection and reporting, which allowed us to see how well we were doing. And if you want to hear more about that, my manager, Jared Doherty, actually gave a great talk on these efforts earlier today called Play Nice, Play Fair, the business case for lowering disruptive behaviors, and it will be on the vault if you were unable to get to it earlier. We also introduced machine learning aided technologies to empower player reports. And this tech verifies that a report is something that we believe is bad and can remove bad actors more quickly or protect innocent players which are targeted by someone. However, I do want to mention that this is actually really, really rare. But if it does happen, they are now more protected. And if you want to hear more about the technical details of that, my colleague Ryan Brackney actually gave a talk yesterday about how we architected these systems called Building Abusive Chat Detection Systems with Deep Learning, and that will also be on the vault if you were not able to see that in person. And finally, we added feedback messaging. The first thing we added was a thank you message. This gets sent to everyone who reported a player after we penalized them. It allowed them to see that we do appreciate and penalize people that are reported, that their reports don't just go to some black box somewhere and disappear. We also added warning messages into the game, and these are given to players who are starting to accumulate verified penalties and are getting close to penalization. We wanted to give them a chance to change their behavior before we actually penalized them, because we had started to realize that some players didn't realize that they were actually behaving in an unacceptable way. So all of these things actually led to an increase of trust in our system and lowered the reoffense rate significantly. So that kind of explained this. But how could we further make improvements to the community? We knew that things were still happening, and we realized that there was still some players who were getting their first penalty. And even though they weren't going on to reoffend, there was more than we wanted in there. So we decided to focus on prevention. And it's how do we go about preventing these behaviors? So we decided to dig in and do some more research in the form of focus groups and surveys to find out what was the motivations behind some of these behaviors that weren't happening as consistently, but were still happening. And we found 3 key areas to address: lack of social consequences, frustration over different play motivations, and frustrations over different play styles. And I'll go into each of those a little bit more. So with lack of social consequences, one difference between physical communities and online communities is the effectiveness of social consequences. So for example, in the physical world, if you show up to your job on time, you perform really well, you'll likely be rewarded with a promotion. But if you're often tardy and you do the bare minimum, you're not as likely to be promoted, and you'll just watch everyone else who does show up be promoted. So this is the idea of a societal consequence. By performing well and society's expectations, you are rewarded with a promotion, and by not performing well, consequently, you don't reap the reward. However, in online communities, there usually aren't effective consequences when the community disagrees with your behavior, or a way to reward players who really are star players when it comes to sportsmanship. We wanted a way for the community to have their own set of rewards when someone was acting in a positive way. Frustration over different play motivations. So this was something that we saw in the surveys, and we also read on forums and stuff. Some players wanted to play at a very competitive level to raise their ranks, and while others just want to play with a couple of friends to have fun. So I want you to picture this scenario. You're solo queuing and you're at Diamond Rank, and your team consists of a group of 3 players, also at Diamond Rank, that just want to hang out and play some games together, and then another group of 2 players who are also diamond rank, and they're just trying to raise their ranks because their ultimate goal is to go pro. So they want to go through the skill rankings. And I'm sure you can imagine that even though everyone is the same skill level, the different motivations could cause some conflicts between the teammates. And one of those conflicts could be related to our final area, and that's frustration over different play styles. So some players may want to play to a specific meta that they see as the most effective way to win on a map. However, other players may be more creative and want to find new ways of competing or unexpected ways that may become the new meta. So in our previous example, you can imagine that the two friends who want to go professional may be trying to play to the metas that they see the league players already using on maps, to where the three friends who are just hanging out may have a more creative style of play. So now we kind of knew why we wanted to focus on things and where to focus. I'm going to go into a little bit about how Blizzard approached social systems in Overwatch. So the first thing was that with these three areas, we decided to do two systems instead of one. The first system was the endorsement system, and it really focused on the lack of social consequences. And the second one was the find a group system, which can help with frustrations due to different play motivations and styles. And I'll go into each one in a little bit more detail. So to start, we're going to look at how some of the design choices in Overwatch's endorsement system helps the lack of social consequences. So the endorsement system is an encouragement system in-game that gives players the ability to reward another player in the match for good sportsmanship, good teammate, or being a good shot caller. They can give the endorsement to any player on their team at the end of the match until the start of the next match. They can also give good sportsmanship to a member of the enemy team. The more endorsements a player gets, the higher their endorsement score is. And we'll talk more about each part of the system in more detail on the following slides. But more broadly, it uses positive reinforcements to reward players. So it gives you rewards for being a good player, as a TLDR. This does two things. It encourages consistent positive play, and it provides consequences for disruptive behavior. Some of those consequences would include loss of rewards and recognition. So, getting endorsements increases your endorsement level, which is displayed on these badges, which are usually under your player portrait or on your player profile page. And when we talk about loss of recognition, what we mean is that if you're not consistently getting endorsements, if you slip up and you're not being as positive, or you actually maybe start being disruptive, then you're not going to get the endorsements and your level's going to slip. And then you won't get the rewards or the recognition that you got when you had the higher level, which is also a form of loss aversion. So this often will cause players to want to get that higher level back and to keep going. It also creates a path for redemption. So if you messed up, it's not like you completely miss out. You can continue to work and get your level up again, and then you'll continue to get the rewards that you got at that level as well. And I'll talk more about the reward schedule and how that works in a little bit. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how we thought peer recognition was important, because we really wanted the system to give you an intrinsic reward and a feeling of belonging to the community. And so to do this, endorsements always comes from other players in the match. And we also had looked at some workplace studies that showed that peer recognition actually makes someone's day better, even in the face of adversity. So for those players who maybe were being a little disruptive because they'd actually just had a bad day, like maybe they got in a fight with a friend or their spouse or their kids just not sleeping so they're tired, that this could actually brighten their day a little bit. And because of cross-team chat, we do allow enemy players to endorse each other when they're exceptionally sportsmanlike, whether it was grace in victory or humility in defeat. So rewards. Endorsements uses rewards to give you an extra bonus in addition to the intrinsic rewards and the peer recognition. So rewards were actually a really big discussion for us. It was important for us to give players a reward that they would find useful or that they'd want, but we didn't want to encourage the wrong behaviors either. We wanted it to just be a nice bonus with most of the push to succeed coming from your intrinsic rewards. So we decided to give loot boxes for players. And we wanted to make sure that we were doing this on a more randomized schedule so that even if you slipped, you could still come back and continue to get rewards. And the way that schedule looks for us is if this is when you started playing after the system was put in place, and this represents just time, probably over months, then randomly, on no particular schedule, we'll do some checks. And that's what these vertical lines are. And if at any check you were endorsement level 2 or higher, you're going to get 1 or more loot boxes. However, if you had slipped during any of these checks, then you are not going to get a loot box. And we felt like this was a really good way to ensure that people could always come back and get more rewards. Another big discussion for us was how many categories should we choose? We had talked about having several categories, we talked about having 1 category, and ultimately we wanted to make sure that there was a balance between an overwhelming number of categories, but also have enough categories to reward every type of positive player. From the person who calls out plays and keeps the team cohesive, to the person who may not be as vocal, but makes switches to the characters needed and always puts the team first. So ultimately, we decided on 3 categories. The first is shot caller, and this was designed to reward those players who really think about the needs of who really call out plays and leads the team. The next was good teammate, and this was for those players who really think about the needs of the team, and whether it's choosing the perfect role for the comp, the perfect counter pick, or just being where they needed to be for the play. And finally, we have sportsmanship. And this is designed to reward those players who are really positive and respectful throughout the game, whether your team is winning or losing. And this is the only category that can also be given to the enemy team. And speaking of sportsmanship, one of the most complained about things when we did surveys in regards to sportsmanship was people who left the game early, especially in competitive. So we wanted to discourage players from doing that by putting a leaving penalty in your endorsement score. And so the way that works is if you leave a game prematurely, you will lose endorsement score, which could potentially mean that you lose endorsement rank. And when we surveyed players who had lost rank in the endorsement system, the majority knew that they had lost rank due to leaving games early, and many mentioned that they were working towards improving their score by leaving games less often, being nicer, and encouraging their team more. So now we're going to look at how some of the design decisions for the LFG system helped with frustrations over different play, motivations, and styles. So this system can be used to mitigate frustrations by allowing players to form groups that match their motivations or style. So if we go back to our example from earlier, there's potential for frustration between the group of friends who just wanted to have fun and the group that was trying to raise through the ranks. And it likely could have been because one really wanted to play to a meta they felt that was effective, and the other wanted to be more creative. With the looking for group, you can actually make a group where you lock in the roles that you want to have in your team, or you can leave the roles open for flexibility. So you can actually say which of these you want to play and find other players who want to play the same way. Another concern expressed by some of our player base was wanting to avoid players who would easily tilt. And to allow players to form potentially more positive groups, we actually added a filter in the looking for group system that allows you to filter up to your endorsement levels. So if you're in an endorsement level 4, you can form a group with a minimum endorsement level of 4 if you want it. And the idea is that players who are more positive will have higher endorsement scores and will be more positive in game than other players. And we were pretty hopeful about this because there was a study that came out about the 2010 Winter Olympics that did show positivity was more infectious than other communities. So if people were making really positive groups, then the people that they played against in those groups would also hopefully become more positive. And finally, the title field was actually a pretty important field for us. We knew that we could put in loads of different filters and there would always be someone who wanted to form a different kind of group that we didn't have a filter for. And by leaving the title field fairly long and open-ended, we actually let them express exactly what they were looking for. Whether that would be that they wanted to just play for fun or rise to the ranks, or even things that we hadn't thought of, like we want this group to speak a specific language. So I talked a little bit about why we approached it and how we approached it, and that's really easy, and a lot of it was really theoretical. But what's important is, did it have an impact, and what were those impacts? Because that's what people really care about, right? Did it work? And so we ended up looking at two different ways of gaining some of this insight. The first was through in-game telemetry, and the second was through player feedback before and after the systems were put in place. And when it comes to in-game telemetry, there are several key performance indicators which we use to determine if we improved, and I am going to go through each of those. And these include things like the percent of matches that contain disruptive behaviors that are reported, and the percent of players engaging in our systems. Additionally, we also asked players about each of these. And each of these gives us some important information about the health of our community, how changes affect the community, and the success of the systems. So the first one is the impact of social systems for the percent of matches containing disruptive behaviors. So for this one, if this is where we started before the systems were in place, and this was the effect of the system, we have since leveled out. And the difference in those two areas was actually a 40% reduction in the percent of matches that contain disruptive behaviors just since the system had come into place. And at the same time, we ran a player perception survey to really kind of ask players why they thought that this was happening, to see if they also perceived it as a product of the system. And what we found was that players did agree. They said, the number one thing they said was that the system makes people nicer. We also found that they appreciated that they were able to show support or appreciation through the system. So they like that others can support you even if you lose. Or that getting an endorsement is nice. It lets you know that other people appreciate your contribution. So these really seem to indicate to us that the systems were working in the way that we were hoping that they would. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the percent of disruptive behaviors reported. So this is, in our game, one of the ways that we look at trust. And it's, if a match contained disruptive behaviors, did anyone in the match report those behaviors? The idea being that if they trust their systems, they're more likely to report something when they see it. So again, if this is where our player trust on this metric was, this is what happened after the system released, and it has since stabilized. And we found that the difference in these just since the system was a 130% increase in trust, which we were really happy with. Additionally, we did a survey again, and one of the questions that we like to ask in the survey was, how did they perceive the effectiveness of our reporting system? Which is another way to look at trust, because often with things like this, perception can be different than reality. And what we found was it was actually really close. Between the survey right before the system released and the one after it had stabilized, people perceived the effectiveness to increase 126%. And they had a lot to say about that too. They said that they felt like this allowed them to understand if they could trust the other players, and that they could tell who was going to be a good teammate, which is a lot of the things that we really wanted players to take away from this. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about is our percent usage. And I have a 50 to 70% of players have been given endorsements, and this really depends on game mode and region and things like that, but we are really happy with these usage percentages because we also know that not every player is going to use it every time. They may be in a match with people they don't want to endorse, and that's fine too. We are really happy with how the system has been doing, but they are new systems, so we're going to continue to dig into the impacts of these systems, make improvements, and see if there are ways to mitigate disruptive behaviors not addressed by these systems. But we have been really happy with the overwhelming amount of support that we've received, both in social media, in the press, and from our player base. Thank you.